Our scripture reading comes from John 18, and I read in the NIV from verse 37. "You are the king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him."
Thank you, Bella. Thanks for that reading. And I'm continuing a series on the Gospel of John this morning. And just before we start on our Bible study together, I'll just ask you to bow your heads with me as I invite the Holy Spirit to be with us in our Bible study this morning. Dear Father in heaven, these are your people here. They've come to hear your word, to hear about you, to get closer to you. I ask that my words this morning are encouraging, that they help these people, your people, to strengthen their faith and to give them hope for the future and to give them joy today. Ask this in your holy name. Amen. These are some of the resources I've used throughout this series of sermons. Today is looking at a dialogue, which is at the end of this section, between Pilate and Jesus. And that meeting of the powers that be at that time and the much greater power, which is Christ. The king, the Caesar, and his representative here, and King Jesus. And this meeting has been inspirational for a number of artworks over the years. This is a very, very old artwork. It's 1,500 years old, so it was just maybe 450 years after Jesus was on earth. And it's depicting here, you can probably see on the right, you have Pilate sitting down and he's doing the classic washing of his hands. We have many, many works of art which look at this incident that we're going to be discussing this morning. Right down to very recent ones, where Pilate here is depicted as an Epicurean. Okay, back in the Roman days, you were of one of two philosophies, either a Stoic or an Epicurean, and by the look of him with his glass of wine here, he's more of the Epicurean. Okay, just before we look at the passage together, just want to have a quick look at the overview of John. We note that chapter 1 is the prologue, 2 to 12 are the 7 discourses and 7 signs, the public ministry of Jesus. Then we've just been looking at the chapters 13 to 17, which are the farewell discourses, which are intimate discourses where Jesus is speaking just with his disciples. And now we're in the section which deals with the crucifixion in chapters 18 to 19, and we'll be finishing off chapter 18 today. Chapter 20 deals with the resurrection, and then 21, the epilogue. Now, when we look at chapter 18, last time I preached, we looked at Jesus being arrested and then Peter's first denial. Today, we'll be looking at the high priest questions Jesus, 19 to 24. 25 to 27 is Peter's second and third denials, because it's only been his first that we've dealt with so far. And finally, Jesus before Pilate. And I really want to look at some of the questions the question that Pilate asks, what is truth? Okay, if you can come with me now, we will read this together, a first reading where we just get an idea of the whole passage, and then we'll look at it in a bit more detail after that. So, firstly, the high priest questions Jesus. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together, I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter's second and third denials now. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, the final section, Jesus before Pilate. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is the custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, but not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. And the rest of this section, which deals with Pilate and the trial of Jesus, continues in chapter 19, which we'll do in the next sermon, next time I preach on John. Okay, now, let's have a look at some applications that we're going to which we'll arrive at the end of the sermon. And I'm just flagging them for you to start with. What is truth? An easy question or a hard one? I'm going to say that the Bible is our source of truth. I'm also going to say that God's love for humanity is truly expressed in the Bible through the mission of Jesus. I'm also going to tell you that the Bible tells us that joy and peace are truly ours if we walk in our daily life with Jesus. I'm also going to admit, though, a concession. I'm going to say our walk with Jesus has its ups and downs, just like Peter's did. It's pretty obvious that Peter had a bit of a low time in the passage we're reading about. Okay, so let's look at this together now in a bit more detail. And first of all, let's have a look at the high priest questioning Jesus. You might be a bit confused by this because we're not quite sure who's referred to as the high priest. So let's have a look. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. So in the other Gospels, I'm talking about Matthew, Mark and Luke, who is the high priest? It's Caiaphas. Okay, he's the one who's who questions Jesus. Okay, this is not happening in the Gospel of John, though. Because if we look a bit earlier in John 18, we're told that they bound him, that's Jesus, and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. And then John the author reminds us that earlier he identified Caiaphas as the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So in John's Gospel, he recalls that the first trial was really with Annas rather than Caiaphas. Now, Jesus, in his dialogue here with Annas, says, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret." Is this strictly true? Well, when we just looked at that plan of the Gospel of John, there are a few good chapters there where Jesus is speaking in the upper room to who? Just his disciples. And we talked about this theme in the Gospel of John. There is an inner circle and the outer. So what is Jesus claiming here? What he's claiming is that there's no separate teaching to his inner circle. The teaching that he gives to his inner circle is consistent and exactly the same as the teaching that he gives when he's out there in the temple or on the mountain, when he's teaching everybody who comes and cares to listen to him. That's what he's claiming. "Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." What's Jesus doing here? Is he just being a bit annoying? Why doesn't he just say? Why doesn't he respond to these questions? Okay, when Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. It sounds like by the reaction that he was just being annoying with what he said. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. Well, one of the reasons why he was slapped was because Jesus is actually subtly telling them how they need to run their own trial. In Jewish trials, it was not up to the person who they were trying to convict to defend themselves. He could just sit there and say nothing. It was up to the prosecution to bring in testimony, to bring in witnesses, to set up a case. So all the effort had to go in on the side of the prosecution, not on the defence. So Jesus is already being asked all these questions here. He's being cross-examined before there have been any witnesses that have come forth in this account of the trial with Annas. So Jesus is actually telling Annas subtly, "You're not doing this trial correctly. What sort of a judge are you when you're not even following due process?" Is it a little bit clearer now why he gets slapped? Now, Jesus' response here: "If I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" The words here are if I said something wrong, if I said something, kakos is the Greek word for it. And you know this word in words like cacophony, bad sounding stuff, okay? So if I'd said something bad, kakos, then again, bring in your testimony, bring in your witnesses to tell me what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, and it's actually not the word that we were saying earlier for truth here, it's if I spoke beautifully, kalos. And we know that from words like calligraphy, beautiful writing. If I spoke well, if I spoke fine, in other words, if I said what was correct, why did you strike me? Now, we read it was slapped, didn't we? It's actually a lot harsher than that. It's a word that originally meant to flay or to skin something. That's how it was used way back in Homer's time. Later it was to beat, so this is quite a hard and violent act It's not just a little slap on the cheek. And we even use this as an expression, I gave him a hiding. So hide, okay, it's coming through here in the Greek. Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So my question there, just who is the high priest? Well, they both are, okay? They're both high priests. Annas was the previous high priest, and because, because when you become high priest, you stay high priest for the rest of your life, then both could be referred to as high priest. And so it's out of respect that Annas is also called high priest in this passage. Let's now turn to what's happening outside. And you may wonder, why is there this change, this constant change of scene between what's happening inside the court and what's happening outside? And it's because John is intentionally drawing a contrast. Jesus is being asked questions inside. Peter is being asked questions outside. In a Roman court, I've just been doing a little bit of study on the early martyrs, and the martyrs, initially the church was persecuted by Jews. Then later it became the Romans when the number of Christians grew. And so we know all about the martyrs who are eaten by wild animals and things like that in the great Roman circuses and things like that, at great Roman arenas. And in that situation, one of the Roman governors would ask, before he condemned somebody to die because they were Christian, he would ask them 3 times, "Are you a Christian?" If they said yes, then he'd give them another chance. If they said yes, another chance, yes, then they would go to their death. So this was part of Roman law, that you were asked 3 times. Do you find it interesting that Peter's denial is 3? So we're going to be reading about Roman law soon when we look at what's happening with Pilate. And you'll see that Pilate's asking Jesus a number of times, "Are you king? Are you king?" So the idea there is to give the accused a chance. So not that they misheard the question. So 3 times that you're given that chance. So Peter's being asked questions. Is he responding the truth? He's denying Jesus, isn't he? He's saying, "I don't know the man." So Peter, in the outer courtyard next to the fire, is denying Jesus, saying not the truth. Jesus inside is saying the truth in response to those questions that he's been given. So this contrast, we're going back and forth, inner and outer. Now we're back on the outer part, looking at Peter. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself by that fire where we left him at the end of verse 18. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." And you may remember this from the last sermon, but I went through the Amy statements, okay, the ego Amy statements of Jesus, the I am statements. And there are 7 of them in the Gospel of John. They're things like, "I am the good shepherd, I'm the light of the world," etc. And when Jesus was asked in the garden, "Are you Jesus of Nazareth?" he responded, ego Amy. He used that really authoritative expression, and that's when people fell back. And we contrasted that with Peter's denial of Jesus when they say, "Are you a follower of Jesus?" And he says, "Uk Amy." So this is exactly the same construction, but the negation of it. And we talked in the last sermon about how the contrast there between Peter and Jesus, and how we as followers are much more like Peter than we are like Jesus. Now, that same language occurs here, where when he says, "I am not," he again says, "Uk Amy." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. So this is the 3rd time. This is the 3rd opportunity he has to say that he follows Jesus. And if you think about people reading this maybe 50, 60 years after it was written, and they were being faced by people, by Roman officials who were asking them, "Are you a Christian?" And they were asking them that 3 times, and their life depended on this. It's interesting how they would relate to this text that Peter denies Jesus 3 times. At that moment, a rooster began to crow. And you might think there's not much to say about that. It's pretty obvious. It must be fairly early in the morning and roosters start to make a bit of noise. But some Bible scholars have seen something else here. So at about 3 a.m, between 2 watches of the night, there was a bugle call, which was called the rooster crow. So perhaps Jesus is saying, before 3 in the morning, you'll deny me 3 times. So it could have actually been a military sound that they were hearing rather than an actual rooster. Okay, let's now focus all our attention on Jesus before Pilate. The Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. So, we've had questions from Annas, then we've gone to Caiaphas, and then suddenly we're straight to Pilate. So John doesn't cover any of the trial where Caiaphas is present. He skips over it. Why? Well, we've discussed this in the past. What I said was that the Gospel of John was written probably 20 years after the other Gospels. And so if he leaves things out, it's intentional. They've already covered it, so he's happy to bring out different details that they haven't covered. But if he thinks that they've covered it satisfactorily, he leaves it. There are a number of other things that John doesn't cover. For example, the trial before Herod. Do you recall that happening in the other Gospels? So it's Pilate, then it's Herod, then it's Pilate again. Before that, we have Caiaphas. Just between Caiaphas and Herod, the first visit to Pilate, there's also a meeting of the Sanhedrin. So there's all these other trials and meetings which aren't mentioned by John. Here we have, by now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Now, throughout our study of the Gospel of John, one of the most impressive, the things he likes to do from a literary point of view, is irony, having ironic things. So just having a look at that verse, can you see any irony? Have a think about it while I talk to one other point in this verse, and that is, why weren't the Jews allowed to go into a Gentile residence? How was it going to make them ceremonially unclean? So I looked this up and I found quite a disturbing reason that one scholar raised, and that is that apparently the tradition, the usual practice, if there was an abortion, was just to throw it down the plumbing. And so this is a dead body going out through the bathroom, yeah? And this is among Romans or Greeks. And so that commandment that if you're near a dead body, you have to go and clean yourself ceremonially, was something that the Jews were worried about whenever they went into a Gentile residence, because there could be dead bodies there because of this practice. Now, what would that mean? Well, it would mean if it was a dead body, they would have to wait 7 days to be ritually clean after that. And this was right near the Passover, and I don't want to miss out on a nice big meal. Yeah? So maybe Pilate's not the only Epicurean in this passage. So what's the irony here? Well, the irony is that we're quite happy to put an innocent man to death, but we're not willing to go into that room because I want to eat a dinner later. Okay, this is quite a trivial thing compared with what they're actually doing. So Pilate came out to them. Oh, how nice. Well, the Romans were pragmatic. Okay, they were quite happy to use whatever power structures were there when they came into a colony and took it over, because if the people were running their own society, then it was cheaper for the Romans. They didn't have to bring in all of their equipment and people. So Pilate is also pragmatic about religious beliefs. He thinks, look, it's just easier if I just wander out there and talk to them. What charges are you bringing against this man? Okay, very good question, because we've actually got two different charges, one of which Pilate does not care about at all. The first charge is blasphemy. Okay, Jesus claims to be the Son of God. And Pilate doesn't care, because Caesar's the Son of God. Through lots of stories in the ancient world, there was lots of sons of God. No big deal. So that doesn't bother him. So, in order for this charge to stick, they have to go down the line that Jesus is starting an insurrection against Rome. That would bother Pilate. If Pilate can see that Jesus is a revolutionary trying to incite riot and rebellion against Rome, then this will be a crime against Pilate and a crime that deserves execution. Now, the Jews know that the Jewish leaders know that they're on sticky ground here. So this is a classic argument. What do you think of this one? If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. There you go. The proof is that he's here. We brought him. So of course he's got to be guilty. Okay? Not exactly fair, is it? Okay? And if you think about what's been happening and how these trials have been happening through the night, none of that was particularly legal. Okay? It really should have been happening in the day, and there should have been a 24-hour process in Jewish law to allow if it's a capital offence, okay, before anyone's executed. Pilate says, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. In other words, you haven't given me a proper charge here, so I'm not going to do what you want just because you brought him here. They say, we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. Were they right? Were they right in saying that? Is it true that the Jews could not execute anyone? Okay. What about stoning of Stephen, which happens just a couple of years after this? I would say that technically they are probably correct. They are definitely correct about a crucifixion. The Romans crucified, and the Jews stoned. I would also say that the Jewish leaders at the time did not feel like they had the nation with them. They didn't feel like they had the public opinion all against Jesus. There were enough people who supported Jesus who were going to make this difficult if they decided to stone him. Not the case with the stoning of Stephen. By then, the disciples were dispersing, and there was enough animosity among the Jewish leaders that they were able to stone Stephen. Was it particularly legal? Maybe not, but they could get away with it. So really, the Jews, the Jewish leaders, if they had had enough public opinion on their side, would not have needed to use Pilate. But they need Pilate because they don't have that support. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. So what kind of death was it going to be? And why did it have to be crucifixion? Okay, in John 12:32-33, Jesus says, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. So here in this verse, it's implying he's going to be lifted up on a cross, very different to being stoned, where you'd be cast down to the ground. So this being lifted up, we said, was an expression that meant glorified. Okay, there's another verse here. Why does it have to be crucifixion? Well, from the Jewish leaders' point of view, they knew Deuteronomy 21:23, second part, which says, "For anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse." So all those people out there who believe in Jesus and are following Jesus, when Jesus dies a death where he's under God's curse and he's claiming to be the Son of God, perhaps that will be the end of that movement. So this is why the Jewish leaders in particular wanted a Roman death and not a stoning. Any other reason? Well, I've mentioned this. I don't think there was enough support for the stoning. Okay, let's have a look at 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Now, the scene has changed. We don't have Jesus' disciples, they've all disappeared, they've all run off. We don't have the Jewish leaders anymore. We just have a tete-a-tete, okay, a dialogue between two characters only. So the scene has been cleared and all we have is Pilate and Jesus. And Pilate's got these questions because he wants to know what's going on. He wants to know what's all this about. So Pilate's question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Okay, and you can imagine, strike one. Okay, he's going to ask him 3 times, strike one. If he says yes, well, then he gets 2 more opportunities, and after that, he'll be executed. Jesus says, "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" This sounds a little bit sassy to our modern ear, doesn't it? Is that your own idea? But, Jesus could be asking, Do you believe that I'm a king of the Jews? Or is this just what the Jewish leaders have been saying? Pilate replies, "Am I a Jew?" In other words, I've got no idea about what's going on between you and the Jewish leaders. Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done? Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." Do you wonder how much Pilate would have understood of any of this? So he's distilling all of that down to, so you're a king. "You're a king then," said Pilate. Strike 2. "You say that I'm a king." Okay, again, Jesus isn't confirming or denying. "In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth." Okay, and now, kids, what was the word? Aletheia. Okay, cool. So it happens twice in this verse. I came into the world to testify to the aletheia, the truth. Everyone on the side of aletheia listens to me. Now, Pilate's response, what is truth? Now, we can read this in quite a dismissive way, but it sounds to me like he is echoing his school teachers from way back in school when he was asked those questions that I was also asked when I was 13. Where do you come from? Where are you going? What is truth? The great philosophical questions. How do you know what is true? Or is there irony? Does John include it for irony's sake? Okay, why would this question be ironic? Well, John 14:6, Jesus has said, one of the great ego eimi statements, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Pilate is asking Jesus, who has claimed to be truth, what is truth? Perhaps he should have asked, who is truth? This ego eimi statement looks at 3 different things, and they help to answer some of those questions, those philosophical questions. They answer the question of, where do I come from, where am I going, and what is truth? Okay, I am the way. The word for way is hodos, and you know it because it's the name of the second book of the Bible, exodos, the way out. So Jesus is talking here. Also, there's a Hebrew term for the way, which is derek, which talks about the way that you live, okay, your path, your ethical path. And so Jesus here is claiming that salvation, the way out of slavery, Exodus, all of this comes from him. The life, the life is to do with the future, isn't it? The eternal life. And the truth is his message about where you come from. You came from sin. You came out of captivity. You are now saved. And you are to look forward to heaven. You look forward to eternal salvation and eternal life. These two things are truth. So, back to Pilate's question. What is truth? With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. So when he asks Jesus what is truth, and he doesn't realise that he is speaking to the source of all truth in terms of the gospel writer, he still believes to a certain extent that Jesus is innocent because he can't find any basis. Now, Pilate thinks, we said he was the great pragmatist, is there a way I can get out of this? It is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? They shouted back, no, not him, give us Barabbas. And then we have this note that Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. And we'll continue with that in the next sermon. But let's have a look now at these applications. My first one is, what is truth? Now, how many people get silly news items on their phone that ping up all the time and you end up, I think it's called clickbait, is that right? You click this one and then that makes you click something else and then you click something else and you end up reading all about Harry and Meghan and all this nonsense. Well, that's the question. What is truth? And we've been told through this news on our phones that this is Harry's truth and Meghan's truth. Not absolute truth, but their truth, and therefore it's legitimate. Now, these two, a lot of Harry's truth has been about these two, and they have not had an opportunity to reply. Okay, well, they've decided not to reply. So, do you think their truth might be slightly different to Harry's truth? Maybe, okay? So from this use of the word truth that we read about in the media, we get the idea that there is no absolute truth. Everything is subjective. And in fact, this is one of the problems when anyone wants to study, for example, history. Because whenever you read an account of something that happened historically, you have to then ask the source of that account, are they objective? How do we know how objective they are? And we get to the point where we say, well, nobody's objective, everybody is coming from their own slant, therefore there is no absolute truth, therefore there's actually no real point in studying history whatsoever because you'll never arrive at the truth. So that obviously puts us in a position, well, what do we do with all the history teachers and the history books? And what do we do with any knowledge? So as Christians, how do we feel about this? Is there objective truth or is all subjective? Okay, well, your secular person will say, I believe in scientific truth, because that's obviously proved and has to be true. Well, I think earlier in the kids' story I said I love science. And I see science as finding out God's truth in the natural world. Doesn't mean that I believe and follow every single theory that science comes up with, because as we know, those theories change over time. So not even scientists would believe in an element of absolute truth when it comes to different theories. They look at evidence and they say evidence supports that, or it supports this, and over time maybe the first lot of testing wasn't correct for whatever reason. Okay, so scientific truth. I was at a dinner party recently and somebody told me, I believe in science. And luckily we didn't get into a debate, because it's not polite, is it, to talk about religion or politics at a dinner party. But this gentleman raised it, and I was very close to responding. But I think that he misunderstood what science is. Science is a methodology, it's not a religion. It cannot replace religion. Okay, religion is something where you have to have faith, you have to believe. You have to be able to believe without evidence. Okay, he's a famous environmentalist. And if you think about his truth, and how many people watch David Attenborough's nature shows? They're wonderful, aren't they? And whenever you see something incredible in nature, he is full of wonder at the power of evolution to get to this stage whereby, through many, many different mutations we got to here. Whilst when I look at it, I'm full of wonder and awe at the wonderful designer and the God that made this beautiful thing. So we both are full of wonder. We both have the same reaction. We have that commonality, but we have a completely different worldview. And so our truth that nature is wonderful is based on two completely different worldviews. But we do share something. And I want you to understand that there are lots of truths out there that we can share with the secular world. We're not totally bereft of any common beliefs. This verse here in Revelation 11:18, the time has come for destroying those who destroy the earth. As Christians, we believe in the environment, in valuing the environment. I mean, Genesis 1, when God made something, what did he say afterwards? It was good. He made some good stuff. And then it was our job to be stewards and to protect it, not to abuse it. So as Christians, we believe in valuing the environment. So we have common ground with people like David Attenborough, who's a very keen environmentalist. Okay, what about social justice? Well, that's also mentioned in the Bible. The Bible is full of calls for social justice. Amos, let justice roll like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Beautiful, beautiful passages about social justice in the Old Testament. Is there truth outside the Bible, or is all of it in the Bible? Well, one of the things that's supposed to be really important at the moment is gratitude. If you're more grateful, then you're less likely to grumble, you're less likely to be anxious, then you're going to be a happier person. Well, you don't have to tell a Christian that. Every time a Christian sits down to a meal, they say grace. They thank God. Every time they come to church, we thank God for so many different things. In fact, most of our day, whenever we're engaged in prayer, we're thanking God. So gratitude is something that we think is incredibly important, but we identify to whom we are grateful. And that is much more powerful, I would say, than just being grateful to circumstances or the universe out there, whatever that is. So, yes, we also believe in gratitude. We think that is a truth, and that's something that we hold in common with the secular world. However, we know to whom we are grateful. Karma. Some people say, I believe in karma. You know what we call it? We call it a final judgment. Because even in this lifetime, karma doesn't always get around everyone. Who knows what's going to happen to Putin, for example, depending on which side of that argument you lie. Who knows what happens to lots of criminals who don't necessarily get punished or caught. Okay, so karma doesn't always apply. However, as Christians, we believe in a final judgment. We believe in eternal justice, where we know that when you need a good judge, let's make God the judge, and God will get it right. So yes, there will be repercussions for terrible crimes that are committed. So yes, in that sense, we share this belief with people who say, I believe in karma, but we believe it's going to be done correctly. So let me conclude with this. The Bible is our source of truth, of aletheia. Sorry, I've just been through that. God's love for humanity, this is what it tells us, is truly expressed through the mission of Jesus. The mission of Jesus tells us that joy and peace are truly ours if we can walk with him. Our walk with Jesus has its ups and downs, just like Peter's did. We can see in the passage today Peter's 3 denials. Okay, he would not have been a martyr, let's put it that way. What happens though when we fail? Jesus is there to forgive us every time we fall and to reconnect with us. And that's where I want to leave you today. God bless. I'd like to pronounce a blessing on you now, and I apologise to Mary who gave me a prayer scarf to hold up to use, and I was just too disorganised to get all my stuff together today, so I'm having to do it without. So I just ask you to bow your heads. Yivalecha Adonai v'yishmelecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunicha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord raise his countenance towards you and give you shalom, peace. Amen.